FM104.com. Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. Greetings and salutations, my friends, my neighbors. It's good to be here. Good to be able to come to you every week and to share thoughts and ideas and get some feedback also in terms of what you think is going on. I'm African American. I think you can tell. And African Americans in this country and also throughout the world have been in a constant state of struggle no matter where we are. That's just a fact. Many of our people, because of a lack of communication, are not aware of all of the Africans that exist throughout the world. Just want to talk about it. I want to talk about the struggle that continues to perpetuate itself in Africa, the struggle that continues to participate and happen in other parts of the world. One, shall we say, relatively unknown set of Africans, or people know they exist but don't know that they're Africans, or origins were in Africa, or in the Pacific. Black people live and are the native population in Australia, in Guinea, New Zealand, and they have been subject to how can I say it, being murdered, killed, destroyed, their land taken away from them. And folks somehow think they got a right to come to another area and take the native population's land. And they have this sense of superiority that somehow God has ordained them to be able to do this. It's just a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. And in our own country, the country where we were born, I was born, you were born, some of you were born and raised, it's a situation the same. You have a native population that have been forced into reservations, forced, and treated like they're less than human beings. In some cases, the land has been taken away from them. Slavery exists. We, as African people who roots, Black people, are in the continent of Africa, were brought here through the so-called Middle Passage and enslaved in this country, up to build the economy of the country. It's just a shame, a shame, a shame. So there's a lot of things that we need to know and we need to learn about what's going on in this country. Got a couple of videos. I'm going to start with a video of civil rights leaders discussing this issue. And then we're going to discuss it also. And then I have another video in which we're going to take a look at the assassination of the former Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. But first, let's start with this civil rights dialogue.
After the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro community has arrived at a decision to celebrate this centennial in an all-out effort to achieve full rights now.
You're watching a live national television show that was broadcast in the spring of 1963. It's more than 60 years old, and yet I feel it's so relevant to issues we face in the United States today. It's also amazing because of the eloquence of these 5 American black leaders who are about to discuss the state of the American Negro. I'm David Hoffman, filmmaker. I didn't shoot this, but I was a college senior and I was watching this show on television with my parents, and what I saw affected me, and it made me decide to go down to Washington and attend the March on Washington that summer. It also got me to make my first documentary, which is posted on my channel, from 1963, about migrant workers in Riverhead, Long Island, near where I lived. So look, before I run this amazing show, I got to tell you a little bit of background, which I think will matter to you. It was the spring of 1963. President Kennedy is exciting the nation with the feeling that all kinds of new things are going to happen and America is going to be great. It's also 100 years after the Congress passed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. There was new and bold legislation before Congress, and it was exciting legislation because it had to do with voting rights, giving Negroes, as they said at the time, the right to vote and making certain that they could vote. To support this legislation, the 5 major Negro organizations in America announced that they were going to have this march in Washington to support the legislation. The issue of civil rights in America had been fomenting for several years. 1960-61, black students in the South began to protest by sitting in at lunch counters. Martin Luther King in the late 1950s had his bus boycott, and the march in Birmingham, and other things were happening around the country that those of us in the North, people like me, were watching, very sympathetic to what the students were trying to do, get people to vote. So National Educational Television, the forerunner of PBS, decided to do this live show with 5 Negro leaders, the top guys, talking about what they hoped would happen at this march. It's prophetic. What they're saying so long ago is so relevant to what people are saying and thinking and troubled by today. There was Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP. There was Whitney Young Jr., the head of the Urban League. There was James Farmer, the head of the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE. There was James Forman, the head of SNCC, who had been training students in Mississippi to attempt to register voters. I knew young people who were attending these training sessions who went south, and I thought they were heroes. This was scary stuff. And there was the Reverend Martin Luther King, the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The host was Dr. Kenneth Clark, a professor at New York's City University. So much of this is relevant, as I said, and I'm going to post a link in the description to the film I made as a result of seeing this program.
Gentlemen, I certainly want to thank you for taking time out of a terribly busy schedule to talk with us this evening. I know that the entire country, and certainly the President of the United States and some congressmen, would like to know about the plans for a march on Washington. Mr. Wilkins, would you like to tell us what are the plans as of this date?
The plan is for a huge march to the Lincoln Memorial and a meeting there. On the way, what was described as a brief demonstration at the White House. But we hope to have this an outpouring of expression on the part of the people who wish Congress and the nation to know how they feel, how very deeply they feel about civil rights legislation. I think it's fair to say, wouldn't you say, Martin, that this is no attempt to blackjack anybody? We want to show how we feel.
Exactly. We are not going to Washington to intimidate any congressman or any senator. It will give a large number of people an opportunity to articulate their longings and aspirations for freedom, their desire to see meaningful, forthright civil rights legislation in this session of Congress. And of course, we also intend to arouse the conscience of the nation over the economic plight of the Negro 100 years after emancipation. And I think it can have a great impact. I think it will dramatize the issue. It will have educational value in that it will allow many people to see and understand the continued indignities and injustices which Negroes confront all over the nation.
All over the country, it has captured the imagination of hundreds of thousands of people. Now, we don't know how many of them will be marching to Washington, but a goodly number will. They feel keenly about this, and they want the seat of government. They want the American conscience to know how they feel.
You're aware that the president has cautioned that he would just as soon have the march postponed or not occur.
We see this as an all-inclusive demonstration of our belief in the president's program, and since it has been declared to be an orderly demonstration with a rally, at which time I hope to be one of the people who will speak in the interest of the Urban League toward preparing people for the new opportunities. At this level, we will be cooperating.
And I think it's important that the march go off because there is legislation which many people have gone to jail for the substance. That is, the lunch counter demonstrations throughout the South have to be sort of brought to some climax, and it could be done in this public accommodations bill, which is before the Congress. Then, of course, it just left the Delta and a lot of poor people over there, people who make $2.25 a day for 12 hours of work. And so some legislation has to come out of the Congress of the United States to deal with these problems.
People like Agnes Myers, Roy, president of the board of the NAACP, and other white liberals and friends have cautioned against having a major demonstration for civil rights this summer. How do you...
Well, it's our position in the NAACP that the opponents of civil rights legislation left no doubt as soon as the president spoke. In fact, they didn't wait for him to speak. They began announcing their opposition and what they intended to do. They were going to filibuster, they were going to hold up appropriation measures, they were scaring the country that they weren't going to get a tax cut on account of civil rights. They're doing all the boogeyman stunts. And if they're going to use Washington as their base of operations for opposition to this bill, we don't see anything wrong with using Washington as our base to indicate support for this bill. And in my estimation, this march is going to be a 100% outpouring of the disgust and distress of black Americans and white liberals over the way the Congress has handled this bill.
I think that in any such demonstration as the march, which is planned, you will expect loud outpouring of cries, of fears from many, many people who don't want it to take place, who are afraid that something might happen. But it seems to me that it reflects a lack of understanding of the nature of the times in which we are living. The fact that Negroes all over the country are concerned and are aroused and must express their feeling. They've waited 100 years, and that's too long to wait.
But what about white friends and liberals who have worked in these organizations for many years, who now say, look, let's not go this fast. Let's not...
We don't have people like that. I'm sorry. Our telephone is ringing with white people who want to get into the march.
We don't judge our friends on the basis of the color of their skin. We judge them on the basis of the fact of whether or not they are willing to go all the way with us. If they are not willing to go all the way, then they are not friends of ours.
Now, we've said that these are interracial organizations, but you five gentlemen are Negroes. You are assuming the leadership, and you are asking white liberals and white friends to go along with the Negro speaking for himself rather than speaking through white surrogates.
I would like to make this point because I think there is a misconception that any white people who happen to serve on your boards or committees are therefore automatically there to exercise control and restraint. Yeah. This is not the experience of the Urban League. There are many white people who serve on our boards who are asking for more militancy. I speak for the National Urban League, at their insistence, not at my demanding, because they feel that a Negro is best able to express the hopes and the longings of his people.
We ought to be clear that there is a desire on the part of Negroes for self-expression through leadership of civil rights organizations. This is important because Negroes have been denied that self-expression for so many years. But this does not mean, in any sense of the word, as far as I'm concerned, that white persons who are sincere.
And I think it's very important to have this participation. I think it would be very dangerous and even tragic if the struggle in the United States for civil rights degenerated to a racial struggle of blacks against whites, so to speak.
Amen.
It is a tension between justice and injustice, and we enlist consciences in the struggle. We appreciate the participation in this movement of white persons of goodwill, and we have many of them, fortunately, and I think the number's growing every day, and this helps to keep the struggle on the level that it should be on.
Sure. As far as I can understand you gentlemen, this is not a racist march. This is a march of aroused Americans who want to demonstrate and assume their rights to petition their
And
Congress
want to witness.
and
want to
witness and support the president's civil rights legislation. The Attorney General would seem to disagree with you in terms of his testimony for Congress. He says that the most disturbing thing for Negroes is the public accommodation segregation.
The truth of the thing is that it's a vicious circle. Unless people are adequately educated, they can't possibly find good jobs. And unless people can find good jobs, they can't buy good housing, which puts them in good neighborhoods where they can get a good education. So instead of being one major thing, it's a group of things.
Yes, that's true, but it seems to me, of course, that the public accommodations matter, which is now being batted around in the Senate Commerce Committee, is the most abrasive and pervasive of the aspects of a Negro's life. Every time he steps out of his front door in the morning until he comes home at night, he runs the risk, and some of them don't run the risk, they run the certainty, of this kind of denial and humiliation and mistreatment. And sometimes in the South, as you well know, in many subtle ways. You walk into a store and you're ahead of you're the next one to be waited on, but 3 white people come up and they get waited on first. This is a matter, Negroes meet this. In many places they have to ride on the back of the bus. And they do want a Coca-Cola and can't get it. Now these seem small things, but then I think the Attorney General was talking about the things that rub people the wrong way and make them say, oh, let's get rid of it, you know.
And, you know, there are other areas of life which are very subtle, but which are not even being covered in the bill. And then there's some pronounced ways. I'm just thinking of the fact that you drive through the South. In some states, you can't even stop at the restrooms, and it's humiliating to women, you know, and it's very...
And of course, uncomfortable.
Well, it's very uncomfortable, but it's one of these little daily things. But I think that there are 2 areas that should be covered, you know, and that's the question of the voting bill. I don't see why we can't have universal suffrage for all Negroes. I mean, I really don't see why it has to be just a 6th grade educational level, because that's a device, and I think we were talking beforehand about how many people would be covered.
The Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is putting a great deal of its effort on voting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we have a great program down, I think, in the Delta of Mississippi, but Roy might want to amplify on just how many people would be covered by a 6th grade education.
Well, the literacy test bill,
Yes.
you know, we agreed, well, we estimated, we couldn't, that not more than 100,000 Negroes would be added to the rolls under the literacy test. This is, Martin, you remarked on the number of people who didn't have a 6th grade education in one state. For 58%, I think it was, in Louisiana.
We testified before the House and suggested universal suffrage. I mean, there's just no reason why a person is not 21, he can't vote. He can go into the Army whether he can read or write. So why shouldn't he be able to vote?
And this is no sign that the person isn't intelligent, that the person doesn't have some basic intelligence, but because of discrimination and other conditions, many of these people haven't had an opportunity to get an education, and I think they should have the right to vote, and this is very basic.
No president has recommended a bill of this scope before, regardless of how we who suffer may feel its limitations, and I think we ought to work with that. dangerous, as Jim has said, Jim Farmer has said,
Yeah,
to
we
pick
have two
out
Jims.
priorities, and because the opposition will start concentrating on your target. They say, well, what do you think is the number one? And this is, we have to avoid.
Roy, you made the point that no president in certainly my lifetime has made this kind of civil rights recommendation to Congress. Why do you think President Kennedy did this?
He did it because a crisis was created that demanded the attention of the nation on the highest level. Just like, well, a dust bowl is something beyond the state and beyond the region and demands federal action. A great disaster like Texas City demands national action. A great flood demands national action. And here we have a crisis in human rights brought about by one of the, in great part, by all of us, of course, but triggered by a man who sits around this table. And I think there's no doubt that Birmingham dramatized and brought into focus what Martin Luther King and his associates did in Birmingham, made it, the nation realize that at last the crisis had arrived.
It's necessary, it seems to me, and I just like to throw this out, to keep a considerable amount of pressure on. I mean, that is, the Negro does not, say in Mississippi, for instance, he has no constitutional means, that is, Eastland does not represent him, to achieve some solution, and this has to come from the government, or either he simply has to demonstrate. In other words, segregation may be like a piece of old iron, you put it in the fire to heat it up. And that so that people outside of Mississippi have to become conscious of what is going on there. For instance, there are 45 people in jail right now whose trials were held today for simply being at a voter registration meeting, and someone threw a smoke bomb in the church, and they marched down to the Justice of the Peace Office to protest, or rather to the deputy sheriff, and they were arrested for disturbing the peace. And these are old ladies, some of them 75 years old, but yet they want to stay in jail.
The people that have the vote don't realize how much they could do by writing a letter.
That's right.
A congressman said to me, I have 8 letters on civil rights, 8 from his district, 8. And 5 of those were from white people. Now, you don't have to write a polemic. You just have to write a postcard saying, please vote for the Civil Rights Bill.
In traveling around the country, however, I hear many people make utterances which seem to indicate that they think the millennium will have arrived after we get civil rights legislation. That is not the case. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Even if we get the entire package that the president asked, plus various of the other good bills that are pending before Congress, a good legislation does not automatically enforce itself. We then have a problem of seeing to it that it is enforced in town after town, city after city, and only the will of the people will bring about the enforcement.
I would like to say that I have faith that the American people today are sufficiently convinced of the determination of Negroes to be truly free, and the rightness of that aspiration, that I will be terribly disappointed if there is not a tremendous amount of support from all people for this legislation. But I would agree with Jim Farmer that this will just be, to me, the beginning. It's sometimes a lot easier to get people to walk a picket line than to walk to the library, or to get people to participate, parents to demonstrate, than it is to go to PTA meetings.
One of the heartening things about this aroused conscience that Martin spoke of a moment ago is the unprecedented activity of the organized faiths, the organized religious faiths. I think we're going places on this, but I'd like to put in a little sour note here. And I get some mail that I can't read on television, that I can't exhibit, and the postmaster delivers like this, holding it up by the people who say that Negroes ought to go back to Africa, and you're only apes anyway, and you think we're going to give you a civil rights bill, you're crazy, and we'll run you in the Mississippi River first, and a whole lot of other uncomplimentary things.
I'm really more concerned about the so-called gentle people of prejudice. The people who will say, I'm with you, I am for you, but What
You were
about
going too
property
fast,
values, you know, and the man's right to run his business? And what about the standards of the school being lowered? And so for these reasons, who would say, well, maybe you shouldn't have all of this right now. These are the people I'm really concerned
May
about.
I comment on that? I agree with you completely. While I share Roy's concern about the extreme bigots, I'm far more concerned about the good, the decent people who don't throw a bomb as they do in Birmingham or other places in the South, but they quietly pack their bags and move away. And this, it seems to me, is more damaging to our cause and more dangerous to the total cause of integration.
I have an answer for you, gentlemen, but go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, well, I'm concerned about the one in between, going back to Africa and moving away, and that's basically the public officials, you see, who inflict all of this brutality, because the millennium is not going to come primarily because we have no laws to deal with police brutality in the South, which I think is a fundamental issue in this whole
Well,
thing.
Jim, I suppose you are very conscious of this because your membership is on the firing line, and
Yeah, and I've seen
daily
people,
the
yeah,
victims
you know,
of police.
And Dr. King just came from Danville, and over a month ago we saw 35 people with holes in their heads as big as a ashtray, inflicted by the police. And nothing has been done about it. And the government, it seems to me, ought to do something about this.
What specifically would you suggest for dealing
Well,
with
I would
this?
suggest, you see, that the government go in and file some suits. When the constitutional rights of a person is denied, the government ought to file a suit in behalf of that person. I think this gets back to part 3.
That's right.
Now, the government says that the existing laws are inadequate, but yet they're not asking, or it is not asking, for adequate laws in this legislation.
I think the only thing that changes the mind of a policeman like that is to sue him and to convict him and to convince him that the Constitution has some control over that billy club he has in his hand.
Is there anyone who is planning to do this? Roy?
Well, now we're entering into one of the most difficult areas of civil rights, because the whole area of convicting a policeman for depriving a man of his civil rights has to be proved down to the last period and comma. Not only that, his intent has to be proved.
Jim?
Yes, I think we have an additional weapon, and that is the ballot.
Yes,
the vote, and which is why all of us here are pushing a voter registration drive. If Negroes are registered in large numbers down there in Greenwood, then the police, of course, will take a different point of view. And in Danville also, because they'll know then that they have to be responsible and responsive not only to white voters, but to Negro voters as well.
White people in the South and in the North need education on this matter. I don't mean education on humanity as to Negroes, but they need education on the constitutional rights of Negroes and on the fact that he's a citizen. He's been here 344 years, and to hear some of them talk, they'd say, look what we're doing for you people.
Mm-hmm. If you've never been in Mississippi, and Roy was born, and I just have to get back because I think I have to just try to help. Well, I'm sorry, your family was. I was raised down there, and I want to talk about these people. See, I think the president ought to go through Mississippi because I don't think he has any conception, any visual conception. Intellectually, he knows the suffering that's going on there. But just to see some of these shacks that people are living in, it's frightening in a sense, you know, down in Itta Bena. You know, it's just a very depraved area.
Itta Bena? Yeah. I've been to Itta Bena.
Isn't it a depraved?
Oh,
it's
really
pitiful.
And I think what we need to get at here is if we could get the total society to somehow lose this making a god of state rights and begin to see citizens as national citizens.
Right.
Because what's actually happened in this country is much of the miseducation, lack of education altogether, much of the social disorganization we see in the North that concerns us can directly be traced back to the indifference of the people in the North to the problems of the South. Right. These people later become the welfare load, the crime rate of the North. If we had adopted the concept of a citizen in Mississippi being a citizen of the United States, then we would have avoided all these problems. That's the way they're seen overseas.
That's right.
I think the president ought not only look at the housing in Mississippi, he ought to look at the slum tenements in Harlem and in 100 Harlems across the country. Indeed, we might say that our people are not only being bitten by dogs in Birmingham, Reverend King, but by the rats in the slum tenements.
Well, aren't we saying, gentlemen, that a program has not yet been worked out to grapple with the magnitude of this problem in the United States, both north and south.
It's
And
not
You're
regional.
so right.
isn't there a need now, because of the urgency and the seriousness of the situation, to develop a sort of crash program to lift the standards of the Negro and to get rid of the underlying conditions that produce so many social evils and develop so many social problems? I think this is what we face at this time, and I know it leads to the whole question of discrimination in reverse and all of that. But I think we've got to face the fact in this country that because of the legacy of slavery and segregation and the seeds of injustice planted in the past, that we have this harvest of confusion now, and we're going to continue to have it until we get to the root of the problem.
Well, that's that root and the rats go together.
Yeah.
The announcement of the Real Estate Brokers Association some time ago advising their members not to pay any attention to fair housing laws, that property rights still came first. And when you think of the billions of dollars in this country tied up in real estate, there isn't much that the President of the United States could do by going and looking at some slums, let's be fair.
Yeah, well,
The real power and obstacle there is the property right structure in this country, which isn't concerned with how many kids are bitten by rats or how many people live in slums.
Most of you recall that we did announce recently, our board adopted this domestic Marshall Plan, and this was
Yes.
consciously given this name because, if you recall, this country has spent some $12 billion on rehabilitation of Europe, war-torn Europe. In a 4-year period, we have spent millions on refugees from Cuba and from Hungary. We spent all kinds of money giving free education to veterans after the war and making it possible for them to buy homes. I think the time has come for us to honestly face up to the fact that this tremendous gap due to historical deprivation that the Negro has suffered will not be closed not quickly enough unless we consciously and deliberately establish programs that call not just for equal schools, but better schools and better teachers and provisions for housing and conscious recruiting at the level of employment. This has to be done in order to get rid of what I see too much of, and that is the feeling of despair and hopelessness.
I think that Negroes have had special treatment in this country for 350 years, special treatment of a negative sort.
That's right.
Now what Whitney and the rest of us are asking for is some special treatment of
And
a
a
positive
positive,
sort to
right.
wipe out that gap.
Are you united in this, or is there any...
Well, I want to be
Well, yes,
understood
we
on
are.
it.
But I'm not asking people to hire people who aren't qualified.
And we're
But
not
you're
asking
asking-
them to skip over white people or to deny white people their chance, but we're saying that just giving the Negro an equal break
not enough.
is not enough.
I wonder,
Across the
gentlemen, if
board.
you're in asking for this special break, you're not asking for a special break for the nation rather than just for the Negro.
Oh,
it will
indeed.
be.
Very
Look,
definitely.
if this country, they don't solve the human rights problem of the Negro.
right.
The manpower
This
problem.
country morally is sunk.
Not only
Absolutely.
Well, what about
Not only morally.
practical manpower
Well,
and human
but
resources?
they've been suffering from manpower all along, and I anticipate what Jim's going to say. Not only morally sunk, but they'll be sunk.
they'll be sunk economically
You
too.
see.
Economically, politically, and morally.
The President's Council of Economic Advisors said some months ago that discrimination in jobs against Negroes costs the country something like $13 billion a year.
If you gentlemen are correct that it cannot survive without instituting justice,
Well, it can't.
is it possible that the society will choose not to survive rather than to...
Not consciously.
Not consciously.
Not consciously.
Well,
No, I seem to sense that increasingly more people are beginning to see integration as an opportunity and not just a problem. The fact
are
that we
these
place-
only articulate people, though? Are these
No,
only
I-
the people to whom you talk? What
there are
about the
some
masses of American whites? Could it be that they are so conditioned to hate Negroes
No.
that they would rather see the society go under rather than to provide.
Well, I
It's not
don't-
the
I don't
masses.
think
Politicians might articulate
No,
this.
the average white person in this country doesn't want to see his country go under rather than give a fair deal to the Negro. He believes in a fair deal, but he also wants to protect himself and his job, and I don't blame him.
I have read a number of writers on this, and the most eloquent of the writers seem to me to be Mr. Baldwin. And if I read underneath his lines, there seems to be a deep sense that maybe the American white man is not prepared for survival and justice. But as I listen to you gentlemen talk, you do seem much more optimistic than this, Jim.
Well, Kenneth, I would not go so far as to say that the American white man is prepared not to survive in order to avoid giving Negroes equal rights. But I will say that I would not be prepared at the moment to put our cause to a general referendum in this country.
No.
I don't think we'd win it.
I don't think civil rights are negotiable.
I think I could almost predict what the figure would be.
Of course.
2-1 against you.
I'm sure it would be.
Well, isn't it true that we're grappling with a problem that constantly emerges in history, that you have a few people who are crusaders in the right direction. You always have a few people who are crusaders in the wrong direction. And the vast majority are out there in the middle somewhere with a great deal of apathy and complacency. And I think we have this in our country today. The vast majority of people are not active integrationists or active segregationists. They are passive adherents to the status quo.
But
and
they
I
have
think
been
the
socialized
job,
in a
yes.
society in which racism is dominant.
I agree, and I think the job here is for the creative minority to work on this large group, because I think these people are pliable to the legitimate and just demands of the Negro. And I do not choose to follow the path of despair, because I think that there is a way out, even though we do have to face the problems that have developed and the conditioning that has developed as a result of this problem existing a long time. But I do think there is a way out, and I think that with the creative minority standing up with determination to solve this problem, we can solve it.
Whenever the American people have been faced with a crisis, they've come through. Now, they may have come through in ragged and bloody fashion, but they've come through. And I'm convinced that they'll come through this one, even though it involves very deep-seated emotions. I think they're going to solve it.
I've always had the feeling that one of the major problems was that the average white citizen somehow drew a correlation between status and exclusiveness, and in many cases racial exclusiveness, so that the more exclusive the neighborhood, the school, the place of employment, the higher his status. Now, I think...
But he's been taught not to like you either.
Yes,
and
but
not
now...
to like you because of the color of your skin.
Yes, but now he must be taught that this is a sign of his basic insecurity, that for years, as Baldwin put it, he has had a reason, a need to feel superior. Now we must change the norm and get people to understand that it is insecurity that makes you want to take advantage and to hate, that only the secure people now can move toward inclusiveness. It is the more intelligent, the more mature people who want this kind of thing, and only the tragically insecure need today to surround themselves with sameness.
Gentlemen, I certainly want to thank you for what certainly is the most stimulating and to me quite instructive discussion. I think that America is indeed fortunate to have men of your breadth, your perspective, your sense of responsibility and intelligence as the leaders of probably the most significant social revolution since the 18th century. It certainly is my personal opinion that you 5 men are the contemporary versions of our founding fathers who risked so much and dared so much for freedom and liberty.
You have been listening to the icons of the civil rights movement during the 60s, the leaders of the major civil rights organizations. I won't name all of them. You just saw Jim Farmer, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Whitney Young, people who believed in the struggle and was deeply involved in the struggle. What was absent and what wasn't there was some of our African American female leadership. It should have been a woman there on that panel, because females will bring a different kind of perspective to the whole issue, a different type of sensitivity, tremendous organization skills. That wasn't been important. And one other thing that I thought was absent and wasn't mentioned was the massacres that took place in Black community, where hundreds of Blacks were killed. Also, for example, when we relate to the Black Wall Street, where the government went in and supported racist whites who destroyed an entire community and murdered over 300 of its citizens. Rosewood, Florida, massacres occurred in Rosewood. As a matter of fact, massacres occurred in places that we don't even hear much about. Killings that weren't massacres, hanging of individuals. And generally in some of these local communities, the police were part of the problem. They were a member of the Ku Klux Klan. They were part of the local organization. Not all of them. There were some that were opposed to it. We had some Black who were able to enter into law enforcement, who supported equal opportunity. That's real. And in some places, we had organizations like the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which helped to protect and save African American lives and white lives, because a number of white people were murdered senselessly by these folks. Terrible thing, terrible thing. But some of the issues that these gentlemen discussed still are here today, and some of the solutions we're using. For instance, the vote. There have been 2 presidential elections where African Americans helped to turn the tide. One was Barack Obama, in which African Americans overwhelmingly voted for Barack, and Joe Biden. With the help of Black leadership, Biden was able to win with the largest voting majority of any president, even more so than Obama. He won by 7 million votes. That's a whole lot of votes. 7 million votes. Barack Obama won by. So some of these things we do apply. Some of these things we know continue to exist. Now, it's too bad that most of these gentlemen, in fact, all of these gentlemen are now deceased. They no longer live, but their spirit remains alive and well. The other phase of it we want to talk about is while we were fighting local battles of discrimination, racism, segregation, and even our so-called friends would tell us that maybe we're moving too fast. In Africa, our people were fighting colonialism, and the same enemies to freedom, justice, and equality in this country were enemies in Africa. And supporting the colonization, the raping and robbing of the land and abuse of the land in Africa. African fought physically, through demonstration in every way they can, to obtain their freedom. Great leaders tried. One such leader was Patrice Lumumba. So we're going to look at a video now about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba.
For scholars, my name is Don Wolfensberger. I run the Congress programs here at the center, and I'm standing in for Christian Osterman, who is out of town this week. As you know, this is part of our the History and Public Policy Center's series, and this is co-sponsored by the National History Center, an initiative of the American Historical Association, represented here today, as always, by our co-chair, William Roger Lewis. We'd like to acknowledge also the support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations for helping out with a weekly seminar. Also like to thank Marion Barber, who is with the National History Center, Allison Lilakoff of the Wilson Center for helping to organize today's event, as well as all the others, and we are also grateful for the assistance of Hannah Monroe Morris. So thank you. Today, as you know, the topic is the Lumumba assassination and CIA accountability, and we're pleased to have with us Dr. Stephen Wiseman. He started out as a professor of political science at the University of Texas at Dallas. He's taught at Fordham University and the Université Libre de Congo, and he came to Washington in 1979 with the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he was with the subcommittee on Africa. And many of you may know that Howard Wolpe, who passed away recently, was the chair of that subcommittee. And so he is a friend of Howard's and a friend of the Center's as a result of all that. But he worked in the Congress from 1979 to 1991. He has since been involved in a variety of things, working with the Department or the Agency for International Development, where he worked on their democracy and governance in Africa project. He's also been doing some work on campaign financing, so he's got many and varied interests. But I think for the purpose of today's event, you should know that he is author of two very prominent books. One, American Foreign Policy in the Congo, 1960 to 1964. I believe that was published in 1974, if I'm not mistaken. And more recently, and I do like this title because I think there is a lot in that, and that is A Culture of Deference, Congress's Failure of Leadership in Foreign Policy, and that was published in 1996. Dr. Wiseman is a graduate of Cornell and earned his master's and PhD at the University of Chicago. Before we go further, I want to turn things over to our co-chair, Roger Lewis, for any comments that he would like to make.
Just to say that I'm very glad that we were able to persuade Steve Wiseman to speak on the Congo. Congo is one of those subjects that keeps recurring in historical debate, historical assessment. The records continue to unfold. It's a matter of interest from the European point of view, specifically, of course, from the Belgian point of view, as well as Africa and the Congo. And especially for the today's topic, the assessment of the CIA. We do have a ritual in which we ask everyone to introduce himself, herself, and Marion Barber would also like to explain why we are asking people to make sure that we have your email addresses.
Director of the National History Center, and we are passing around a list for you to sign in on to make sure that we have your email address if you're not somebody that we normally communicate with, or if you are somebody we normally communicate with. We have about 60 to 90 names that bounce back on a regular basis. So we'd like to have everybody's correct email address, even if you are somebody that manages to hear from us in some way or another. So please sign in. Thanks.
I'm Ross Johnson, Senior Scholar at the Wilson Center. Stephen Shore with the PBGC.
John Prados with the National Security Archive.
Bill Burrow, National Security Archive.
Kenton Clymer, I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Robert Baum. I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center and an African historian.
Michael Neufeld, Smithsonian Institution.
I'm Giwon Kwon, Wilson Center Scholar.
Petro Prish, Romania Scholar at Woodrow Wilson Center.
Dane Kennedy, a historian at George Washington University.
Kent Hughes, I run a program here at the Wilson Center on America and the global economy. A little worried about getting email addresses while we talk about CIA accountability.
Good afternoon, Robert Donnelly, Woodrow Wilson Center.
Angela Santesa, Yard Center.
Eric Arneson, historian at George Washington University, fellow here at the Wilson Center.
Christine Kelly, I'm an intern at the National History Center.
Dave Ottaway is senior scholar here at the center.
Robert Brandstetter, an independent.
Doug DeGroat, Executive Intelligence Review.
Bruce Cooklick, University of Pennsylvania.
Hayden Peak, CIA.
Ronita Jones, historian.
I'm Marley Clymer. I'm a retired nurse.
Leland Ellis, Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology.
Fariborz Fatemi, Oxford Charter Group.
I think that's got it. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Got the microphone in the right place. Can you hear me, everybody? A little closer. Okay. How's this? Still not enough, huh? Then I'm not going to be able to see you. All right, how about that? There was a town meeting in the Congo in August of 2009 that was conducted by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. According to the New York Times account, a student stood up and he asked Mrs. Clinton if he were to become president of the Congo tomorrow, and if he tried to be independent from the West and follow his own ideas, would he be assassinated? And the reporter said, well, this was a thinly veiled reference to the notion that the CIA had a role in the assassination of the first elected head, really, Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. The question itself shows how much this issue still resonates in the Congo. Here we have a student who probably was born at least 30 years after these events. And still there is a persisting feeling that the United States did something that was not appropriate, that was wrong in this important African country. And it has persisted among other Congolese scholars who've looked at, for example, the rule of Laurent Kabila, who was head of the Congo, president of the Congo a few years ago, a former follower of Patrice Lumumba, indicated when the UN were trying to get the United Nations in there to control some of the violence that Kabila was bitter and skeptical because of the past of what had happened then. So this has had quite a resonance, and of course, in Africa itself, the United States image, if you speak to former officials, was hurt for many, affected by the image that the United States had been associated with Lumumba's assassination. The death itself, and the death meaning his physical death, and the fact that because of it he could not be a factor in the Congo's politics, had a lot of consequences. It confirmed the course that had been pursued by the Eisenhower administration and was beginning to be pursued by the Kennedy administration of excluding Lumumba's followers because they were considered too far to the left, too militant, too anti-Western. But that led directly to very bloody rebellions in the Congo. No one knows how many people were killed in the Lumumba's rebellions in 1964 to 1967, but some people number it in the hundreds of thousands. Both the direct violence and the repression and some of the violence by the rebellions themselves, but also in terms of the starvation of people hiding in the forest and that sort of thing. And you had, of course, after the defeat of these rebellions, the defeat of this movement which had been quite popular in the Congo, the rise of the Mobutu tyranny. And when that fell, a failed state, which we all know has been an international problem since, and one can't hang everything on Lumumba's assassination, but I think it was a step, an important step toward the Congo we have today. Also, the effect on the United Nations was important. When the Congo became independent in 1960, people felt the United Nations is going to be a very important force in the decolonization movement, and ironing out problems, and in other areas, not just keeping a peace that had been established, but in what you call today peace enforcement. And the United Nations didn't do any of that until the end of the Cold War, after the Congo. The Congo was a test, and in a way, it failed the test, didn't create enough of an international consensus. And one factor in that was what happened to Patrice Lumumba. Now, most Americans, and even many diplomatic historians, are not aware of what I'm going to discuss here, of the fact that there was a CIA role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Secretary Clinton wasn't completely aware of it either, or she didn't seem to be. When she answered the student, she said, I can't excuse this past and I won't try. Congo and much of Africa, she said, has been dominated by, quote, a history of colonialism and abuse. Kind of hanging it on the Belgian colonialists, maybe. But I think there's something to be learned that people have not been fully aware of. In January of 1961, over 50 years ago, Lumumba, who was a prisoner of CIA-financed Congolese leaders who had replaced him after a coup, he was transferred by them to a Belgian-backed so-called independent province of Katanga, which had most of the wealth of the Congo. And he was then tortured and murdered by the Katangese and their white officers, Belgian officers. People up to now haven't focused very much on the CIA role, partly because the Church Committee, a committee of the United States Senate, investigated this and determined, and this is the quote, Lumumba was killed by Congolese rivals. It does not appear from the evidence that the United States was in any way involved with the killing. But this is a mistake. The CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, participated, along with the Belgian officials and Congolese on the CIA payroll, in the decision to transfer Lumumba to this secessionist state of Katanga. There was actually at the time a question of transferring him to one or of the other of two secessionist states, both Belgian-backed. In both states, the leaders had sworn to kill Lumumba. The fellow in Katanga, the interior minister, had said, if Lumumba comes here, we'll do with him what the Belgians didn't want to do. We'll kill him. So he participated in the decision. Not only did he participate in the decision, and here's where the accountability issue comes up. Larry Devlin withheld his knowledge of a plan to transfer Lumumba to one of these two secessionist states from CIA headquarters, from the State Department, until Lumumba was already dead. The telegram indicating he had been warned 3 days in advance of a transfer arrived hours after Lumumba was already dead. If these problems are continuing today. What we have in the Congo is a very unusual form of access. The Church Committee investigated several assassination attempts, and as a result of that, it was able to get access at a moment of
vulnerability of the CIA, because it's during the Watergate era when all the domestic operations were exposed, to lots of cables and things of that sort. But beyond that, there was a lot of stuff they didn't publish. They had private interviews with people like Larry Devlin. They had various hearings. They weren't quite public hearings, but there were hearings with people where they took testimony. There were cables that were not published in their final report. And these are gradually being declassified under the JFK assassination.
We're going to have to, we're going to have to cut short now. We're coming down to near the end of the program. I'll tell you what we'll do. We will continue this video. Chris, let's continue this next week. There's a lot more information in it that you need to hear. I could see that our country has been a tale of two cities. When we take a look at all the billions of dollars we've put in public housing and education and doing and the good that we've done. And the flip side of that is that, well, you've heard it. I want to thank you for tuning in. Tune in again next week. We'll continue this video, and we're going to talk about what's happening in Africa. And like I said, it's a two-sided story. There's some positive things that are going on, and there's some negative things that are going on. But there's things that you need to know, information that you need to hear. So I want to thank you again for tuning in, and don't forget that we're down in still in Lebanon. We have our walls and statues and our pictures, and we look forward to seeing you sometime. Okay, thanks again for joining, and we'll talk to you again next week. Take care now. So long.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. And thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.